Part 2. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but only Congress can declare war. This has been a fight between the president and Congress almost since the beginning of time, in that if the president is commander-in-chief, he should be able to send the army somewhere, fight something. But can he? Because the Constitution says only Congress can declare war. So a number of times American presidents have sent the military to fight, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, without Congress ever declaring war. In 1973, Congress passed a law called the War Powers Resolution, which is generally called the War Powers Act. And it says that the president can only do that for 60 to 90 days, depending on conditions, without coming back to Congress and getting Congress's approval. So something happens and the president needs to send the military off. The president can send them off in the short term without asking Congress, but longer than this 2 to 3 month period, then he's got to come back to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, or there's things that Congress will pass that are short of a declaration of war, where they don't actually declare war, but they provide an authorization for the use of military force. This has been a fight back and forth. Presidents don't think they need to come to Congress unless they want to declare war, and Congress says, whenever you go fight, it's a war. Again, this interpretation of what the Constitution says versus how it's interpreted versus how it was interpreted in the past. It's clear that the Founding Fathers not only didn't want us to have a standing army, they certainly didn't want the president able to go off and fight without Congress's approval. Congress has to approve the money, but it's a whole complicated 270-year debate. The president has a bunch of departments that work for him, the executive departments. Those departments are things like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, that we used to have a Secretary of War, which was the Army, and a Secretary of the Navy, which was the Navy. But because we have the Air Force, now we have, and the Coast Guard for that matter, we have the Secretary of Defense, who's in charge of the Army, the Navy, the whole shooting match. We have a Secretary of the Treasury. There are 12 more of these cabinet departments. There's a total of 15 of them. The departments are actually established by Congress. The president doesn't get to decide what departments there are. Congress does. The last department established by Congress was the Department of Homeland Security. Congress establishes them. Congress gives them money. Congress approves the secretaries. The people who are going to run these departments are nominated by the president, and it turns out that the president selects about 4,000 people who work in these cabinet offices. They're political appointees that the president gets to appoint. A few of them in each one of these departments are approved by Congress with the advice and consent of Congress. So the Attorney General's office, there are 6 people in the Attorney General's office who are approved by Congress, who went through the advice and consent of Congress. And there's a federal law that says who's ever the Attorney General of the United States must have been through the appointment process. So if the Attorney General leaves, one of the other 5 people who've been through the advice and consent of Congress process is supposed to become the acting Attorney General. Now, we just went through where the Attorney General left, and the president put someone in that role who has not been through the advice and consent of Congress. So people have sued. Those suits will probably take so long that that person won't be the acting Attorney General by the time those suits are done. And Congress, if Congress was, say, of the other party, if the Senate was not the same party as the president, you can be sure that they would have done something. But again, that probably would have ended up at the Supreme Court too. So we have this, what does advice and consent mean? And how does it get enforced? And all of that, the Constitution just says advice and consent. Okay. It also doesn't require and we'll come back to this, it also doesn't put any time limits or requirements on that advice and consent. So what powers does the president have in the Constitution? Well, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, we already talked about that, the military. The president gets to make treaties with other countries with the advice and consent of Congress. The president appoints ambassadors and other government officials with the advice and consent of Congress. The president appoints Supreme Court justices and other judges that belong to the federal system with the advice and consent of Congress. The president, written down in the Constitution, has very few specific powers. Most of the president's powers relate to foreign affairs, to the international relationships of the United States. The president's the point person on all those international things. But for the most part, the president is appointing people to roles, and those people are then supposed to do what Congress told them to do within their role. What's happened, of course, is the power of the presidency has grown over time, even though it's not written down, and courts have generally upheld that increase in the power of the presidency, even though it's not in the Constitution. And we get it's America. It's very interesting to think about what it says in the Constitution versus what we actually do. The president must be a natural-born citizen. You can be in Congress and not have been born in the United States, but you can't be the president if you haven't been born in the United States. So if you've ever seen the movie Demolition Man, they changed the Constitution in that movie so that Arnold Schwarzenegger could become the president of the United States. Okay, the president must have been born inside the United States, must be at least 35 years old. There's actually rumors that Andrew Jackson was not born in the United States, that he was born on the way to the United States, and his parents didn't tell anyone, and so he got to be president, even though maybe he wasn't legal. The president serves for 4 years and may be reelected once. That happened in an amendment. We'll talk about that. George Washington set a precedent that you would only serve 2 terms, and every president after George Washington until Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression only served 2 terms and then stepped away. And then after Roosevelt, we put into the Constitution that that's the way it should be. Remember that presidents are elected by this thing called the Electoral College. Originally, your state legislature picked the electors in the Electoral College, and so state legislatures were picking the president. We switched to popular vote of the president in the early 1800s, but we still have this Electoral College system. So every state has 1 elector for each senator and representative, which means every state has at least 3 votes for president, and some states have close to 50 votes for president. Depends on the state. And if you're saying, how does that affect us? Well, in most states, the candidate with the most votes gets all the electoral votes. So there's a belief among both the Democrats and Republicans that California is always going to end up voting for the Democrat. And that means all of California's votes are going to go to the Democratic presidential candidate. What happens then, again, we'll talk about this more, why would you even bother to vote if you're Republican in California? Your vote doesn't count. And why, if you are the Republican candidate for president, would you ever go campaign in California? Right? Vote doesn't count. The last presidential election, there were 3 states that ended up going for Donald Trump, and those are the margin of victory. Those 3 states spun the election, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. He won those states by a combined 77,000 votes. So you look at Ohio and some of those Midwestern states, those states flip back and forth. It's the states that occasionally flip back and forth that all of a sudden become the determining in what happens in the election. If you got rid of the Electoral College, then California, New York, Texas, Florida, those states really matter. And Nevada doesn't matter so much. So during the last campaign, both presidential candidates were in Nevada several times because Nevada is historically a swing state, and it sometimes goes Republican and sometimes goes Democrat. So the presidential candidates were in Nevada more than they were in California, even though California has 10 times as many voters. Either way, the system, you can talk about why you like the system or why you don't like the system, but it's an interesting system that the popular vote sometimes doesn't matter. Okay, so how do these electoral college things work out? Well, sometimes they're lopsided. George Washington got 100% of the vote twice. In their second terms, not their first terms, but in their second terms, FDR got 523 to 8, Reagan 525 to 13, Jefferson 162 to 14, Lincoln 212 to 21. And remember, how many votes there are depends on how many states there are, right? And sometimes we're very close. Rutherford B. Hayes won the Electoral College by 1. George W. Bush, and we'll have a separate video on this shortly, won by 5. John Adams by 3. Woodrow Wilson by 23. And what just occurred to me is when I said last election on the last slide, that was 2016 I was talking about, really. Jefferson and John Q. Adams were selected by the House of Representatives. If nobody wins a majority in the Electoral College, the election goes to the House of Representatives, where it's a vote by state. So Montana gets 1 vote and California gets 1 vote. And John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, and William Harrison lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. All of those, only Bush got a second term. Do we have 1 person, 1 vote? What's our system?